So friends, I am a man of many interests, and I will on occasion get some weird little obsession, and I will do a deep dive for a couple of months into a subject, and then I'll find something else to get obsessed about. And not too long ago, I was a little bit obsessed with folklore, not the Taylor Swift album, by the way, but folklore as in the little stories and the proverbial sayings and the slogans that for some reason arise in a culture and then just stick around generation after generation, sometimes long after they even make sense anymore. And so recently I was reading about this family of proverbial sayings that were told to pregnant women about how to make sure that their child looked a certain way after birth. Now, listen, you don't really realize how many folk tales there are about pregnant women until your wife is pregnant. And then everybody is coming out of the woodwork to give you their own little folk medicine, folk advice about how to make sure you're going to have a healthy, happy, intelligent baby. Am I right, ladies? You don't realize it until you're like a part of that. And so the folk wisdom that I came across while I was doing my little deep dive obsession could basically be summed up as this: what you look at determine what your child will look like. Has anyone ever heard anything like this before? Okay. You look at something beautiful, and your child will be easy on the eyes. You look at something scary, and your child is going to be scary looking. You look at the color red too long, say strawberries. If you have an obsession with strawberries and you eat too many of them, your child will be born with red birthmarks. These folklores, actually folk wisdom, arose out of 16th century European belief that pregnant women's experiences, what they felt, what they saw, what they ate, what they thought, could impress themselves on an unborn child. The lore is called today maternal impressions. And it was folk wisdom. Maternal impressions was folk wisdom passed down by midwives, by healers, by grandmothers, and occasionally by the mother who felt internal guilt because she gave birth to a baby that looked like a frog. But even with the advent of science, maternal impressions thinking did not go away. Some of you will remember, some of you are the product of, but some of you will remember the 1990s craze telling mothers that if they played Mozart to their unborn children, that their children, it would impress genius-level IQs on them. This lasted so long that even when my wife was pregnant, we had the little baby Einstein CDs. Now here's what may surprise you. That entire theory was later debunked by science. It was also debunked by the fact that some of your children are dumb as rocks. But even so, the idea stuck around. Because impressions thinking is powerful. It says that our lives are stamped indelibly by what came before us. In the time of Jeremiah, the people of Israel were stamped by haunting events that came before them. They were no longer a nation that was self-governing, self-determining, or had its own self-determined geographic boundaries, because the Babylonians had ransacked everything, just as Jeremiah had warned. Before the Babylonians came, Jeremiah had the lamentable task of speaking truth to power, telling the kings, in fact, that God was not happy with their behavior, telling the nation that God was not, in fact, happy with the fact that they had continued to break their promises. But Jeremiah's lamentable task was not just that he had to speak truth to power. here's what made Jeremiah's task especially difficult. Not just that he had to speak truth to power, but he had to speak the truth in a situation that was already irreversible before he even started speaking. He had to tell them, God is sending Nebuchadnezzar to destroy us. And no matter what you do from here on out, nothing is going to change that. It's already hard to hear that you don't, that God is not pleased with your behavior. It is a whole new level of difficulty. It almost seems anti-patriotic to say there's nothing we can do to change the coming reality. God told them in the first chapter, I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and kings to what? To uproot, tear down, destroy, and overthrow, to build and to plant. In 4 quick Hebrew verbs, Jeremiah tells Israel, you will be uprooted as a people, your statehood will be torn down, your city will be destroyed, your leaders will be overthrown. And then all of that was in the first chapter, and we were reading in chapter 31. Vicky was reading from chapter 31. 30 chapters have passed, and all 4 verbs have already become true. It's already a reality by the time we get to Jeremiah 31. Everything Jeremiah said was going to happen. In fact, the people had been so thoroughly uprooted, torn down, destroyed, and overthrown that some impressions-oriented folklore began to take hold within the people. They grew in despair about what the next generation would experience because of what they had seen. And so they had little proverbial sayings. The parents have eaten sour grapes, and the children will be nauseous. It's a theology of despair, a folklore of despair. We ate the forbidden fruit, so now our children will spend their lives puking. It's not exactly maternal impressions, but it is kind of a divine impression, isn't it? The sins of one generation dooms the next generation. To put it in words of our more local folklore, forgiveness just isn't in the cards for our children. They said things to their kids like, don't get your hopes up, because the light at the end of the tunnel is a train. Their sages taught their school children the only certainties in life are death, taxes, and the Babylonians. Or maybe the one I resonate with most is, it is what it is. You can't change reality. We're in Babylonian exile, and nothing is going to change that. It's despair turned into religious folklore. And on one level, for people who are dragged off into Babylonian exile, essentially being made into slaves, their despair makes a lot of sense. You and I can understand that without even having experienced what they have experienced. But here's the surprising thing about what happens in Jeremiah 31. In the midst of this despair, in the midst of this divine impressions thinking, in the midst of these parental fears that things are going to be worse for our children than they are for us, Jeremiah says that whatever makes sense to you, the folklore that makes sense to you, the theology that makes sense to you, God is not bound by what makes sense to you. In the midst of all of this despair, Jeremiah is saying, God is not bound by our slogans and our cynicism. This is not a God who punishes for punishment's sake. This is not a God who delights in retribution. This is not a God who feels despair when we feel despair. This is not a God whose last word is unforgiveness. This is not a God who lets uproot, tear down, destroy, and overthrow have the final say. No, Jeremiah's God is a God who takes these 4 verbs, uproot, tear down, destroy, and overthrow, and adds 2 more. To build, and to plant. Jeremiah's God, in other words, would never let the Babylonians have the last word, because Jeremiah's God is a God who always gets the last verbs. We said weeks ago that our God gets the first verbs. God is always acting before we get there. But what Jeremiah is saying is also that God always gets the last verbs. When our despair has caused us to give up hope, God is still working, Jeremiah says. God always gets the last verbs, and those verbs are always the verbs of life. Jeremiah says that even though Israel has been like an unfaithful spouse to God, even though God might have been justified in forgetting them, God will not do that. God is saving the marriage. God is building something new out of the destruction, bringing creation out of chaos, bringing life out of death. And so no, their children will not be forgotten and ignored. Their children will not experience ugliness just because their parents acted ugly. Their children will have God's love inscribed upon their hearts and their souls. Far from we ate the forbidden fruit, so now our children are going to have stomach aches, God utters folk wisdom we might even recognize. To err is human. To forgive is divine. Or to quote Jeremiah, I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sins no more. God is saying to the current generation, it is what it is, but it will not always be this way. Because no matter how cynical we are and despairing we are, this is a God who is in the business of surprising us. In my devotional reading a few weeks ago, I was reading a book by Thomas Keating, and he said, in whatever way you expect God to show up, God is going to intentionally disappoint you. Because God is not interested in being confined to your expectations. We may expect cynicism and despair and God not being here, but this is a God who is in the business of surprise. This is why Jeremiah has been telling them doom and gloom and despair for 30 chapters, and at the moment they experience it most fully, Jeremiah pulls the rug out from under them and gives them hope. No matter how despairing we feel, he says God tears down injustice and plants justice. No matter how desolate we feel, God uproots the weeds of wickedness and plants seeds of newness. No matter how powerless we feel, God overthrows the schemes of the powerful and lifts up victims. No matter how dead we feel, this is a God who resurrects the dead. This is a God who brings life out of death and hope out of despair. But here's the hard truth. Sometimes the current generation has messed things up so badly that they will not live to see the fruit of what God is planting and building. Sometimes, Jeremiah says, grace takes time. God's hope is not a fast food order. It's rather seed time and harvest. Jeremiah tells them God is planting, but the current generation will not see the harvest bloom. They can release their children to the goodness of God, but there are still consequences for their actions. God is building, but you're not ever going to see the house finished. Or maybe, as our Southern folklore, maybe some Midwestern folklore coming in here too, might say it, a watch pot never boils. Good corn doesn't come up overnight. Waiting on the rain makes the harvest sweeter. Or Hamilton, hope is planting seeds in a garden you never get to see. The hope is not always that things will just get better for me. The hope is that I live in this in-between time with the consequences of my decisions. But if I can live faithfully in this time, things will be better for my children. Hope means living in the in-between times between death and resurrection. The in-between exile and homecoming. It means recognizing that God's vision for this church, God's vision for this city, God's vision for this nation are bigger than my lifespan. I feel like people should amen that. God's vision for this church, God's vision for this city and for this nation are bigger than my lifespan. Like, I feel like we have an entire multiple generation of people who can't think past their own lifespan. We can't even think past our own experiences to consider that other people's experiences may be different than us. And then we wonder why our world is so messed up. And the church of all people should be a people who think bigger than that. We of all people rooted our past all the way back into the creation story itself. We of all people who are drawing on inspiration from a future of every tribe and tongue and nation and people gathered around the throne of God, and somehow we're saying, immigrants don't belong here. We can't think past our own prejudices to see that God is doing something bigger than us. We can't think past our own lifespan. Can I tell you the truth that pastors won't tell? This is not on my notes. Here's the truth that pastors won't tell. Martha's going to back me up because Martha's not getting paid. One of the deepest frustrations that pastors have is when they can tell that their congregants are okay with the church dying after they're dead, so long as you don't make any changes, as long as I'm still alive. Am I right? I'm okay with the church not existing after I'm gone, just don't make changes while I'm here. But God is bigger than my preferences. God is bigger than my nostalgia. God is bigger than my desires. God is bigger than my imagination. Even the ways I imagine God are way too small for God. God has things that God is doing that are bigger than my lifespan, and whether I feel despairing or optimistic, my job is to wait in this in-between moment, believing that God is at work despite how things seem. That hope doesn't deny my failures, or the failures of my nation, or the failures of my city, or the failures of my church, but hope acknowledges them so that I can work with God as God plants something new. Man, I feel like this is an important thing for a church that's celebrating its 200 years to hear. We can, and we absolutely should, celebrate, honor, and remember 200 years of their church's history. But if our vision does not go beyond my lifespan, then we are failing. One of the reasons why we celebrate our 200 years is so that we can then turn around and imagine and help plant the seeds for 200 years after we're gone. That's the kind of vision we need to have. Somebody said a long time ago, I don't remember who, I don't want to claim this as mine, but they said when your memories are bigger than your dreams, that's when your church is going to fail. Let's dream for 200 plus more years. Let's plant the seeds for 200 plus more years. Let's build something that will outlive us. Planting seeds in a garden that we will never see in this church, in this city, in this nation. That's the kind of vision that I think God is calling even a little ragtag group of people to have. You don't have to have money to have big dreams. You don't even have to have all the time in the world to have big dreams. Find the one thing that you can do to help plant newness in this church and in this city, and go do that. You don't have to do everything. Not everybody can be Vicky. She's incredible. I can't be Vicky, and I work here. I understand that you're limited. And I also understand that, with different seasons, things change. You may be in a certain season in life where you have more time, and you're in a certain season of life when you don't have as much time. And what I am asking you to do is find at least the one thing that you can do that can contribute newness to this church, newness to this city. Get involved in that way. It may only be for a minute giving, or maybe it's not for a minute because you don't have a job, but you can do something else. One thing. And when the seasons shift and you can do two things, do two things. I'm not going to guilt trip you and tell you what that is. But what I am saying is that you are called to have a vision that is bigger than yourself. We have a world that is eating sour grapes. Millions of protesters around the country were saying, we've been eating sour grapes. But we're going to stand out here and plant newness. Because we believe in something that's bigger than ourselves. The church should do that. And maybe that's folk wisdom worth passing on to our children. Not despair, not sour grapes, not it is what it is, but this: that God's mercy is new every morning. That there's always another spring after the winter. To err is human, to forgive is divine. And maybe if I can put one more in there that wasn't in the PowerPoints. We are planting a church, again and again, planting a church that many of us will never see, and that is an act of hope. This is the folklore of faith. It's a proverb worth handing down to our children. That's the divine impression that God imprints on every heart that wants to know God. That's the good news of Jesus Christ's death, resurrection, and ascension. That God is always doing new things. Divine impressions are all over this world.